cultural history of the Western Hemisphere prior to the advent of the European conquerors is so dim that even although in the last 50 years a great deal of work has been done, we are still in no condition or position to arrive at conclusions or to attempt a general reconstruction of the situation. Broadly speaking, there is much evidence that the three Americas have been inhabited for a very long time. Some schools of modern anthropology are even suspecting that the records of human existence in the Western Hemisphere may be as long and old as anything to be found in the Eastern Hemisphere. Be this as it may, we are almost entirely dependent upon so-called natural records. Through the excavation of mounds and the examination of ruins, we try to piece together the story of Amerindian culture. The possibility of Asiatic influence, or even European influence, cannot be eliminated. Even when we think of comparatively early times, there is a general suspicion that this continent was populated from Asia. Certainly there were streams of migration over what we call the Aleutian Island chain and Bering Strait. But to me it has always seemed a little difficult to agree wholeheartedly with Dr. Hardlicka in his thinking in this direction. It seems to me that these ancient migrations do not explain the cultural pattern that existed here at the time of the conquest. It would seem more probable that travelers, adventurers, perhaps shipwrecked mariners, did reach the western continents from some other cultured area, perhaps 2, 3, or 4,000 years ago. Something happened here that is not fully explained by any of the records now available to us. Considering, for example, the possibility of migration from Asia by other routes than those at the far north, we know that certain currents are such that it is quite possible to drift from Asia to the west coast of Central America. This drift would be very largely the result of currents which, however, are not so fortunate if the wanderer wants to drift home again. Thus, there would appear to have been the possibility of a one-way travel at a very early time from Asia. We also know that down in the Polynesian area, navigation by means of very large canoes was advanced perhaps further than we realize. We know that in these areas there are canoes that can and have traveled 3, 4, 5,000 miles. That all this western land could have remained untouched by any contact with Asia or Europe or North Africa from the dawn of time until the Columbian voyages just does not seem to make sense. We do recognize the probability that the early Nordic peoples reached the northeast coast of America, and if we may trust the records in Plutarch's voyages, Greek mariners may have explored the St. Lawrence River. Certainly things did happen. And these things left real and genuine marks upon the way of life in the Western Hemisphere. I have not as yet, quite intentionally, mentioned the Atlantic hypothesis. The possibility that an Atlantic culture may have actually laid the foundation for the civilization of the Americas. There is much to suggest in the legendary and lore of the primordial inhabitants of this continent that they were aware that their culture did not originate here. They have the world deluge myth in common with most other peoples of Asia and Africa. And they have a tendency in their recordings to think toward an origin lying to the east of the American continent. This origin does not seem to be fully explained on the possibility of direct contact with Europe. For at any time when this contact would have been reasonable, Europe could not have provided that which these travelers report. So some way we feel that a cultural impetus was given to this continent, or these Western lands, at a time long distant. And that at the time of this cultural impetus, it arrived from peoples already themselves cultured. If, for example, such a movement had occurred 10 or 12,000 years ago, what record do we have anywhere of a civilization that could have equipped the Western peoples for the rise of such cultures as that of the Maya or the Inca? We do not know of any such culture. This would be pre-Egyptian. It would be before the rise of the Greek culture. It would be before anything we know of Chinese culture. It would even probably antedate any reasonable concept we have of Indic culture, which may be the oldest in the world. Thus, from the probable areas from which such contact could be made, there was nothing that would have provided what these people claim to have received. Perhaps then they are justified in assuming that they brought this knowledge from a land or area which has since been submerged and lost to history. We do not wish to labor this point. Our main problem is to try to understand how certain institutions, almost identical with those of classical antiquity, which arose in the Western world and resulted in the Americas becoming part of a broad world cultural pattern. We know that prior to the Columbian voyages, that the peoples of America were not all savage. We know that Cortez, when he saw for the first time the city of Mexico, said that it was the most beautiful city on earth. He called it the Venice of the Western Hemisphere. And he said there was no city in Europe that was its equal. These people, therefore, had advanced far in arts and sciences, and were gradually building themselves a solid political situation. This, however, was interrupted and was never permitted to mature. Yet we must also realize that the city of Mexico, with all its grandeur, with the Aztec-Toltec culture complex behind it, was relatively uncivilized in comparison to the great empire of the Maya lying further to the south. For if the Aztec peoples were coming into cultural maturity, it was because they had derived their inspiration and their guidance from the more southerly tribes. It is hardly right to think of these people as tribes. They were much more than this. They were nations. They were not only nations, but they were great social commonwealths. They had good laws. And with that strange directness of spirit which so often marks these old cultures, they had found remedies for many evils which plague us even today. Many of their laws were wiser and better than our laws. And from what records we can find, particularly in the very marvelous compilations of Fra Bernardino de Sahagún, we know that these laws were kept, that virtues were actually cultivated by the people, that governments for the most part were benevolent. And as Stuart Chase points out, the Central American peoples hold the world's peace record, a great culture, a great civilization that lived and dwelt and flourished in peace for over 500 years. This situation was no doubt due in part to some kind of relative isolation. By the time the Maya culture had reached its zenith, there seems to have been little evidence that these people were aware of the situations existing in other parts of the world. The three Americas functioned in a strange aloofness. Their cultures developed with comparatively little interruption. They had few of the rugged inducements to intensive competition that we know, even though some of the tribes were warlike. This warlikeness was very primitive. It was not a highly sophisticated type of warfare. And among the Mayas, if it did arise, it was entirely defensive. And these people were not, by any means or nature, militant. In fact, they were probably one of the most pacifistic of all nations to achieve cultural maturity. Now, when we speak of the great complex of the Maya or Itzca culture, the Maya is one of those words that doesn't belong, but which we will never get rid of. This culture was not a small thing. It was a great culture. And had it been known earlier to Europe and Asia, probably would have been given precedence over even the cultures of Egypt and Greece in our estimation of human progress. But because it was far away and late of discovery, we have already established ourselves so firmly upon a Greco-Latin civilization that we had no intentions of changing our point of view. In the so-called jungles of Central America, extending from middle Mexico south through the peninsula of Yucatan and down into Central America and almost as far as Panama, there was a great complex of peoples, a complex that produced a giant bursting of metropolitan centers, great cities, splendid roads, marvelous buildings. We do not really know the population of that area, but it must have been prodigious. It must have been indeed far greater than we realize. Although we still do not know how these people fed themselves. We do not know how their culture developed so successfully with such a small amount of available soil and water. But in any event, there are scattered through these jungles over 200 cities. And one or two of these cities, at least, believe it or not, had areas larger than the city of Los Angeles. And we think we hold the world's record. We do as of the moment. Public buildings and major edifices in a number of these cities are 30 and 40 miles apart. Great remnants of marvelous plazas, boulevards, and roads bind these things together. In some of these ruins today, and they are only partly excavated, 50 or 100 public buildings of vast size group around some forgotten core of culture. 200 such cities, connected by good highways, roads that lead almost into the United States, and may have at one time extended as far as Montana on the north and the Andes on the south. We cannot truly estimate, but the city of Chichen Itza on the peninsula of Yucatan, if it was the thriving community that its buildings now indicate, could well have housed 3 or 4 million people. Yet all of it is gone. It was gone long before the Spaniards came. Where these people came from, we really do not know. Where they went, we really do not know. We have many interesting and ingenious theories, but these theories do not all add up. And although there are some who are pretty positive in their thinking, the fact really remains that a great culture arose and disappeared. That this culture was not too remote, we also realize, because the Aztecs were in contact with it, and they were not a particularly ancient people. But down on the peninsula of Yucatan, we had a civilization that produced great astronomers, whose calendar was so good that the Spaniards borrowed it to correct their own. With great institutions of medicine, a highly socialized state where there was no poverty, a highly benevolent institutional government. For while it is said that both the Mayas and the Aztecs had their emperors, and we think of them as monarchies, we should not forget that the emperors were elected, not by heredity. And that when an emperor died, his son did not succeed him. A new emperor was elected. Therefore, we had the beginning of an electional type of government. We also know that these people were highly advanced in hydraulics, that they were splendidly equipped in art. And some of the more recent paintings discovered in the temples of Bonampak and among the ruins of the old Lacandon culture would indicate that these paintings and sculpturings might well have arisen in Western Asia, perhaps even in Japan. All these mysteries finally center around the supreme mystery in the life of the people. That is the mystery of its religion. Every great culture that has ever arisen has had to have a great spiritual impetus behind it. We have no trace or track of what might be termed indigenous religion of a primitive Amerindian. We do not know of any such religion. From the records in Central America, such as have been preserved, everything points to the fact that the faiths of all these peoples were imported doctrines. They came from elsewhere. In the great Maya culture area, which was the most advanced of the three names stand out as representing the great religious leaders. The first and most important of all these, of course, was Itzamna, the father of the Itzas, the mysterious patriarch, who, like a second Noah, led his people across the oceans in ships to the peninsula of Yucatan to escape some deluge that destroyed the ancient islands of mud. Zamna is pictured in the arts of his people as an old man, either toothless or with a single crooked fang, with a large and disproportionately shaped nose. He was the son of Hunab-Ku, Lord of the Skies, was believed to have been immaculately conceived, and he brought his people not only out of another land into safety, but established among them the basic principles of their religion. He was their enlightener. He was the great teacher of these people. The second name that arises in this complex of culture is the name of Wotan. Wotan, founder of the Votanic culture empire at Palenque, is again a mysterious god. He also came from beyond the seas, from another world. He was immaculately conceived. He was wise. And when he established the great temple town of Palenque, he built there the house of darkness, where the secrets and records of his people and their origin, all these important details are said to have been properly preserved. This was also the same Wotan who was called later the Navigating Serpent, because it was believed that in a ship he actually made the journey to the Mediterranean, visited the Temple of Solomon, and saw the ruins of the Tower of Babel. This all belongs to culture legends, but some of them we do not really feel inclined to entirely disregard. The third, and probably the best known of these culture leaders of this area, was Kukulkan, the feathered serpent. He was born of the morning star, conceived of a virgin. He came from a mysterious land far away, the land of the seven colors. And he came and he brought to his people the blessings of wisdom and civilization. He was their great hero. And the totemic mask of Kukulkan is still one of the most sacred emblems to be found among the ruins of these ancient civilizations. Under other names, either as Gukomak or later as Quetzalcoatl, this deity of the feathered serpent was venerated throughout Mexico and up into the southern tribes of the United States. Here were the great culture heroes, the founders of the mysteries. We know that the peoples of this region celebrated religious rites. We know that the Spaniards, when they first came here, were horrified by these rites. Not horrified because the rites were sanguine or terrible, but horrified because it appeared to them that these people were worshiping or practicing a false Christianity. This record is very clearly noted. And one of the reasons we are so impoverished at this time is because of the wholesale destruction of the manuscripts and books of these people by the early missionaries. These missionaries were insulted and probably quite piously disturbed by the fact that a so-called heathen, uncultured people could have such a religion. You can imagine what a missionary would feel like if he asked one of these Indians, in their strange befeatheredness, what he believed. And this Indian replied, as one of them did. He said, "I believe in one God, manifesting through three persons, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost." Yet these Indians hadn't learned this from Spaniards. The only answer the Spaniards could think of was that the devil had been working overtime. Only an infernal power could have caused these strange and distant peoples to have religious rites so similar to their own. For they learned that the son of the great god Bacab, the one and only begotten, had died for his people, had atoned with his own blood for their sins, and that even now the remnants, and there are not many, of the Lacandones still celebrate the Eucharist with the blood of the martyred God. The answer is pretty evident. There had to have been a tremendous culture platform underneath this people. One of the sources of our knowledge of these peoples and their mysteries are the Chilambalam, the sacred books of the headmen of the villages. The great Chilambalam of Cozumel was for many years stored in the library at Merida, but after one of our enthusiastic archaeological teams passed through the area, the book disappeared and has never been seen again. In polite language, it was simply stolen. But in these books, which contain the record of the antiquity of the people, of their laws, of their morals, of their ethics, we know that we are dealing with a great culture and a highly advanced one. There are a number of interesting and sometimes amusing names that have been bestowed upon the buildings and the various ruin complexes of Central America. For example, at Chichen Itza, there is a building called the Nunnery, undoubtedly so called because there never were any nuns near it. This building, which was just named because it looked like an old-fashioned European monastery, or nunnery to some degree, has near it the only three-story building found in that particular complex. And on the end of that building is another little building called the chapel, or an ecclesia. And over the door of this sits the great God of heaven, seated like the Orphic deity in the luminous egg, adorned with the plumes of the quetzal bird, surrounded by the radiance of eternal light. This mysterious being is the Heaven One, the one great God, represented as the Hindus did their Brahma, seated or standing in an egg. This deity has never been explained. Everyone who has tried to study this philosophy and these ideas has been blocked by the lack of evidence, by the lack of continuity of thought, and the fact that nearly everything we do have has been filtered through the Spaniards, which did no particular credit to the Indians by intention, and a lot of discredit to the Spaniards by consequence. The few good Spanish recorders came too late, and the whole subject is locked in an almost impenetrable darkness. At Uxmal, we also have the same mystery. Over the city rises the great pyramid temple of Adivino, the house of the dwarf. What it really was, we do not know. There is also a little building, little in what we see, which is called the Dovecot, so named because of the curious open work of the front elevation of the building. But what interests us is that the front wall is over 2,000 feet from the back wall. So we had quite a building when it was in good condition. Most of these buildings stood upon great artificial pyramids, and the impressiveness of the structures touches us even when we look upon their present ruin. So out of what we have, I made quite a careful study to do what we could with this subject, from the available codices, which are not too numerous, and from some of the earlier Western students, European students, like Lord Kingsborough, who are called visionaries, and from the probings and wanderings of men like Dr. LaPlongeon, who is considered a little mad, out of all of these things put together, we try to piece into some kind of pattern the story of what the religion and belief of these people might have been and how their religions were celebrated. Everywhere the serpent appears. The serpent which has been connected with religious worship all over the world, whether it be the Nagas of India or Cambodia, whether it be the winged seraphs of the Mongolian desert, or the serpents of the Egyptian glyphs, or the ancient serpents of the priestesses of the mysteries of Samothrace. Everywhere the serpent coils out of the case that holds the book. And we find it so represented on the early coinage of the Greek states. The serpent to these people certainly represented wisdom. The winged serpent, which was almost the dragon, was their emblem of adeptship, or of a secret initiation into the mysteries. Their guardian spirits and angel, their mysterious defender, was the Quetzal bird, itself, again, a form of the phoenix. So out of the mysteries of these people come the same symbols that were used in other nations to convey the idea of initiation into the mysteries. The temples of these people, like those of Asia and the Near East, were nearly always subterranean to represent the serpent's hole. Those who went down through the mysterious passageways passed through again the same harrowing experiences that are recorded on the other side of the earth. The only book that we have now that really gives us some little consolation and insight into the mysteries of these people is the Popol Vuh. So this is the mysterious sacred book of the Quiche. And in this we have a complete story of initiation ritual. We then also begin to suspect the reason for some of the strange buildings that exist in this area. For there are certainly isolated structures far away from the general concourse of the people. Why one or two vast temples should arise by themselves in the wet jungle of Palenque or the dry jungle of Yucatan, we do not know. But somewhere amidst the barrenness of a most unhospitable region, you will see the gaunt bones of a great house. Something that must in its glory, when it was covered with the bright pigmentation that ornamented the elaborate and intricate stucco designs, these buildings must have been things of extraordinary beauty. But why were they there? I think the Popol Vuh tells us that part of the training and the upbringing of the young warrior or the young citizen was that he had to make a journey, the mysterious journey that the initiates of all mysteries throughout the world have taken. He had to journey into the wilderness and there go to one of the great shrines or sanctuaries of his people. Apparently in this region, the tendency was for the university temples to be isolated rather than to stand in the midst of cities. Now, what these temples really were, perhaps we can gather from comparison with the Egyptians. A number of scholars have sensed that there was some parallel between the Maya situation and the doctrines and philosophies of Egypt, and a number of identical symbols have been found in the languages of both these people, the written languages, with the same meanings. Therefore, there is some hope in the idea that there was a connection here at a remote time. In any event, the truth seeker went forth to prove himself. The same situation occurs on a less elaborate level among the North American Indian tribes, where it was the duty of the young man to go into the forest or into the wilderness and perform vigil for the attainment of his manhood, and in order that he might, in dream or vision, receive the name or identity of his totem or his guardian spirit. Now, of course, in the North American area, the civilization had not sufficiently developed so that institutional mysteries could exist. But in these Latin American regions, these did exist. So the young man went out in search of truth. He went out to become an initiate in his own right, to be worthy to bear the insignia of the serpent, and also to have hovering over him the protecting wings of the bird of paradise. What happened when he reached these priestly temples, we are not too sure. Even the Popol Vuh does not tell us too much. But there is the suspicion that they represented much the same thing as the priestly institutions of Egypt. Here, in all probabilities, the neophyte was accepted into the lore and legendary of his tribe. He sat with the wise ones. He sat with those who were learned. He sat with those who knew the stories of old things, and probably also with the professors of such arts and sciences as flourished in his day. I think we can safely say that higher education, as it was known to these people, was acquired through these princely or priestly institutions. It is quite possible, however, that the simple forms of knowledge were communicated in the communities themselves. And we are now dealing with a people that had a splendid and very complex written language, more difficult to interpret than the Chinese, and sufficiently subtle so that any type of scientific, literary, or poetic work could be adequately composed in it. We had a great language. More than 5,000 to 6,000 of its characters have already been identified, although not understood. So it was probably the higher knowledge, the knowledge of those things closest to the hearts and souls of men, that came through these priestly institutions.